I hadn't been back to my grandfather's farm in 15 years, not since the funeral that tore our family apart over inheritance disputes and bitter accusations. The 2-hour drive from Minneapolis felt like traveling back through time, each familiar landmark reminding me of summers spent running through cornfields and learning to drive tractors on dirt roads that seemed to stretch forever. The farmhouse looked smaller than I remembered, weathered grey siding peeling in places where Minnesota winters had been particularly harsh. The wraparound porch where Grandpa and I used to sit and watch storms roll across the prairie was sagging on one side, and several windows were boarded up with plywood that had long since warped and split. But it was the grain silo that commanded my attention as I pulled into the gravel driveway. The massive concrete cylinder stood like a sentinel at the edge of the property, its steel cap rusted orange and its sides stained with decades of weather. What struck me most was the heavy chain and padlock securing the entrance, something I had never seen before. I had inherited this property after a lengthy legal battle with my uncle and cousins, most of whom had written off the 160 acres as worthless. The corn prices had been terrible for years, the soil was depleted from decades of intensive farming, and the buildings needed more repair work than anyone wanted to tackle. My family thought I was crazy for wanting the place. I had a good job as a software engineer, a comfortable apartment in the city, and no experience actually running a farm. But something about losing this connection to my grandfather felt wrong, like letting go of the last piece of a man who had shaped so much of who I was. Standing in the farmyard that autumn afternoon, surrounded by the sounds of wind through empty grain bins and the distant calls of migrating geese, I felt the weight of memories and the uncertainty of what came next. The interior of the farmhouse was a time capsule of my grandfather's final years. Dust motes danced in shafts of sunlight streaming through windows that hadn't been washed in decades. The kitchen still smelled faintly of coffee and bacon, though it had been empty for over a year since Grandpa's death. I moved through rooms filled with accumulated decades of farming life. Seed catalogues stacked on every surface, hand tools hanging from nails driven into door frames, and photographs covering an entire wall of the dining room. Most of the photos showed Grandpa with various pieces of farm equipment, but others captured family gatherings, harvest celebrations, and quiet moments that revealed the man behind the stoic farmer facade. In his bedroom, I found his desk exactly as he had left it. Bills were neatly organized in manila folders. Weather records were written in his careful handwriting in a series of notebooks dating back 30 years, and his old rotary phone sat silent beside a notepad covered with phone numbers and cryptic reminders. But it was what I found in the bottom drawer that stopped me cold. A thick manila envelope with my name written on the outside in Grandpa's distinctive script, along with instructions that made my hands shake as I read them. For Tommy, to be opened only after you've found what's hidden in the silo. I stared at the envelope for several minutes, my mind racing with questions. What was hidden in the silo? Why had Grandpa sealed it with chains and a padlock? And why had he left specific instructions for me to find something before opening this letter? Looking out the bedroom window toward the grain silo, I noticed details I had missed earlier. The chains weren't just securing the main entrance, they were wrapped around the entire base of the structure, as if Grandpa had been determined to keep something in rather than keep people out. The late afternoon sun was casting long shadows across the farmyard, and I realized I would need to return tomorrow with proper tools if I was going to investigate the silo. That evening, I sat on the farmhouse porch as darkness settled over the property, trying to piece together memories of my grandfather and the mysterious silo. I'd spent countless summers on this farm, but I realized there were significant gaps in my understanding of Grandpa's life, especially the years after my grandmother died. I remembered him as a quiet man who spoke in practical terms about weather, crops, and the endless cycle of seasonal farm work. He had taught me to drive, to fish in the farm pond, and to appreciate the subtle rhythms of rural life. But there had always been something guarded about him, as if he carried secrets that were too heavy to share with a child. The grain silo had always been off limits during my visits. "Too dangerous," Grandpa would say whenever I expressed curiosity about climbing the ladder or exploring inside. "Old grain can shift and trap you faster than quicksand." I had accepted his warnings without question, the way children do when adults speak with absolute authority. But now, as an adult returning to the property, I realized that his explanations had never quite made sense. The silo had been empty for years, even during my childhood visits. Other farmers in the area used their silos regularly, but Grandpa's had remained sealed and unused for reasons no one in the family understood. My phone buzzed with a text from my Uncle Craig. "Heard you were at the old place. Don't get any romantic ideas about farming. That property isn't worth the taxes you'll pay on it." The message irritated me more than it should have. Craig had fought hardest against my inheriting the farm, arguing that it should be sold immediately and the proceeds divided among all the grandchildren. He had never understood my connection to the place or my grandfather's decision to leave it specifically to me. I turned off my phone and sat in the gathering darkness, listening to the sounds of wind through the empty buildings and feeling the presence of my grandfather's ghost in every creaking board and rusty hinge. I returned the next morning with bolt cutters borrowed from a neighbor and a powerful flashlight I had purchased in town. The chains around the silo were heavier than they appeared from a distance, secured with multiple padlocks that looked like they hadn't been opened in years. The first chain came off easily enough, but the second was positioned awkwardly around the base of the structure, forcing me to crawl through weeds and debris to reach it. As I worked, I noticed that the concrete foundation around the silo had been recently repaired in several places, with patches of newer cement that didn't match the original construction. The main entrance door was secured with the largest padlock, an industrial-strength lock that required considerable effort to cut through. When it finally snapped, the sound echoed across the empty farmyard like a gunshot. I paused, suddenly aware that I was about to cross a threshold that my grandfather had deliberately sealed. The door swung open with a groan of rusted hinges, releasing air that smelled of dust, old concrete, and something else I couldn't immediately identify. My flashlight beam revealed an interior that was completely empty of grain, but filled with something far more intriguing. The walls were covered with photographs, documents, and maps that had been carefully mounted and protected with plastic sheeting. At the center of the space sat an old wooden desk and chair, positioned as if someone had been working there recently. Books were stacked on every available surface, and filing cabinets lined one wall. But what captured my attention immediately was a large map of the local area mounted on the far wall, covered with red pins, handwritten notes, and lines drawn in various colors, connecting different locations. It looked like the work of someone conducting a detailed investigation or research project. I stepped inside, my footsteps echoing in the circular space, and realized I had discovered my grandfather's secret workshop, a place where he had been pursuing some kind of project that he had kept hidden from everyone, including his own family. The documents and photographs covering the silo walls told a story I had never heard before. My grandfather had been conducting extensive research into local history, focusing specifically on events from the 1940s and early 1950s. Newspaper clippings, government documents, and personal letters were organized chronologically, creating a timeline of events that seemed to center around our local community. Many of the photographs showed groups of men in military uniforms, some taken locally, and others apparently from overseas locations. I recognized my grandfather in several images, looking impossibly young in his army uniform. But there were other photos that puzzled me. Civilian groups, official-looking ceremonies, and what appeared to be construction projects in various locations around the county. The filing cabinets contained meticulously organized research materials. One drawer was devoted entirely to military records and correspondence with government agencies. Another contained interviews that my grandfather had conducted with local residents, many of whom I recognized as neighbors and community members who had passed away in recent years. But it was the map on the wall that provided the most intriguing clues about Grandpa's research. The red pins marked specific locations throughout the county, each labeled with dates and brief notations. Some pins marked farms, others indicated spots along country roads or near natural landmarks. Lines drawn between various pins suggested connections or patterns that my grandfather had been trying to understand. A thick notebook on the desk contained his handwritten observations and theories. The most recent entries were dated just weeks before his death, suggesting he had been actively working on this project until the very end of his life. His careful script documented conversations with other veterans, research requests to government archives, and increasingly urgent speculation about events that had been covered up or deliberately forgotten. One recurring theme in his notes was a reference to Project Homecoming, something that apparently involved multiple locations in our area during the early 1950s. The more I read, the more I realized that my grandfather had been investigating something significant that had been kept secret for decades. Chapter 6: Discovering the Veterans Network. As I continued reading through my grandfather's research, I discovered that he had been part of an informal network of World War II veterans who had been sharing information and memories about events that occurred after they returned from overseas service. Phone numbers and addresses filled several pages of his notebook, connecting him to men across Minnesota and neighboring states. Many of the documents referenced meetings and correspondence with other veterans who had apparently experienced similar concerns about classified operations that took place on American soil during the early Cold War period. My grandfather's notes suggested that these men had been sworn to secrecy about their involvement in various government projects, but that advancing age and health concerns had motivated them to document what they remembered. One file contained transcripts of recorded conversations with veterans who described being recruited for special assignments shortly after returning from overseas duty. The assignments involved construction projects, security operations, and transportation activities that were classified at the highest levels. Most of the men had been told their service records would be sealed and that they were never to discuss their involvement with anyone. But decades later, with many of their contemporaries deceased and government documents beginning to be declassified, these veterans had started comparing notes and realized they had been part of something much larger than any individual had understood at the time. My grandfather's role appeared to have been significant. According to his notes and the documents from other veterans, he had been responsible for coordinating transportation and logistics for a series of operations that took place across rural Minnesota between 1951 and 1953. The operations involved moving equipment and materials to remote locations, often under cover of darkness and with strict security protocols. The more I read, the more I understood that my grandfather had been trying to piece together the full scope of these operations and their long-term impact on the local community. His research suggested that the project had connections to early nuclear research, Cold War defense preparations, or possibly both. Chapter 7: The Hidden Bunker System, The most shocking discovery came when I found architectural drawings and survey maps showing an extensive underground bunker system that had been constructed beneath several properties in our area during the 1950s. My grandfather's property was identified as Site 7 in a network that included at least 12 locations connected by tunnels and underground passages. The drawings were incredibly detailed, showing reinforced concrete structures designed to withstand significant force and equipped with ventilation systems, communication equipment, and storage areas for supplies and equipment. The scale of the construction was enormous, far beyond anything that could have been accomplished by local contractors without substantial government support and funding. My grandfather's notes indicated that the farmers whose properties were selected for these installations had been sworn to secrecy and compensated through agricultural subsidies and equipment purchases that appeared to be normal farming support, but were actually payments for their cooperation. Most of the property owners had been veterans themselves, men who understood the importance of national security and were willing to allow their land to be used for classified purposes. But the most disturbing aspect of my grandfather's research was his growing conviction that the bunker system had never been decommissioned. His notes from recent years suggested that he believed the underground facilities were still intact and possibly still being used for purposes that remained classified. Several entries in his notebook described unusual activities he had observed on neighboring properties: unmarked vehicles, visiting farms late at night, construction equipment appearing without explanation, and subtle changes to the landscape that suggested ongoing underground work. His research had also uncovered evidence that the original project had involved storage of materials that were potentially dangerous to local groundwater and soil quality. This discovery seemed to have motivated his most recent investigative efforts as he documented water quality issues on several farms and what appeared to be health problems among residents who lived near the bunker sites. Chapter 8. The Government Cover-Up. Among the files in my grandfather's secret workshop, I found correspondence with government agencies that revealed the extent to which official records of the bunker project had been suppressed or destroyed. His Freedom of Information Act requests had been repeatedly denied or returned, with documents so heavily redacted that they contained virtually no useful information. But my grandfather had been persistent and methodical in his approach. He had contacted multiple agencies, cross-referenced their responses, and gradually assembled pieces of information that painted a disturbing picture of deliberate concealment and misinformation. One folder contained copies of local newspaper articles from the 1950s that reported mysterious construction projects as agricultural improvements or soil conservation efforts. My grandfather had annotated these articles with notes indicating that the actual work being performed was completely different from what was publicly reported. He had also documented a pattern of health issues and environmental problems that seemed to cluster around the properties where bunkers had been constructed. Cancer rates, groundwater contamination, and livestock health problems appeared to be significantly higher in the affected areas. But these issues had never been systematically investigated or publicly acknowledged. Perhaps most troubling was evidence that some residents who had attempted to investigate or discuss these problems had faced harassment, legal threats, or unexplained difficulties with government agencies. My grandfather's notes suggested that a climate of fear and intimidation had been deliberately maintained to discourage inquiry into the bunker project and its ongoing effects. In recent years, my grandfather had been working with a small group of attorneys and investigative journalists who specialized in government transparency issues. Their preliminary research supported his conclusions and suggested that the bunker system represented a significant ongoing threat to public health and environmental safety. But his notes also indicated that he had been warned to discontinue his research. Anonymous phone calls, Unexplained visits to his property and subtle threats had escalated in the months before his death, suggesting that his investigations had attracted unwanted attention from parties who preferred that the bunker project remain secret. Chapter 9. Personal Revelation and Family Connections. As I delved deeper into my grandfather's research, I began to understand why he had specifically left the farm to me and why he had sealed his workshop in the grain silo. Several documents revealed that other family members had been aware of aspects of the bunker project and had actively discouraged any investigation into its history or current status. My uncle Craig, who had fought so hard against my inheriting the property, was mentioned in several of my grandfather's notes as someone who had been compromised or influenced by parties who wanted the research discontinued. Phone records showed multiple calls between Craig and numbers that my grandfather had identified as belonging to government contractors and private security firms. Even more disturbing was evidence that my father had known about the bunker project before his death in a car accident 10 years earlier. Letters between my father and grandfather suggested that Dad had been pressured to convince Grandpa to stop his research and had been considering ways to have him declared mentally incompetent to prevent further investigation. The timing of my father's accident began to seem less coincidental as I read through insurance records and police reports that my grandfather had obtained through various sources. The crash had occurred on a straight stretch of rural highway under clear weather conditions, and the official explanation of mechanical failure had never been thoroughly investigated. My grandfather's notes from the period following my father's death showed increasing paranoia and determination to protect his research from being discovered or destroyed. He had apparently concluded that leaving the property to me was the safest way to ensure that his work would eventually be found by someone who could continue the investigation. But the envelope with my name on it, waiting in the farmhouse desk, suggested that he had left specific instructions for what I should do with the information I was discovering. The weight of that responsibility was beginning to feel overwhelming, as I realized that my grandfather had essentially passed the burden of his dangerous research to me. Chapter 10. The Underground Discovery. My grandfather's maps and diagrams included detailed instructions for locating the entrance to the bunker system on our property. According to his notes, the main access point was concealed beneath a concrete pad near the barn, hidden by decades of accumulated debris and vegetation. Using the measurements and landmarks he had documented, I spent an entire afternoon clearing away brush and digging through layers of soil and gravel. The work was exhausting, but eventually my shovel struck something solid, a metal hatch cover that had been painted to blend with the surrounding concrete. The hatch was secured with a combination lock that my grandfather had included in his notes. As I entered the numbers, my hands were shaking with anticipation and fear about what I might find below. The lock clicked open, and I lifted the heavy cover to reveal a steel ladder descending into darkness. The underground chamber was larger than I had expected, with concrete walls, fluorescent lighting that still functioned, and air that smelled stale but breathable. The space had been designed as a communication center, with radio equipment, telephone connections, and banks of electronic devices that appeared to date from the 1950s and 1960s. But the facility had clearly been used more recently than its original construction date suggested. Modern computers sat alongside vintage equipment, and filing cabinets contained documents with dates from the past decade. Maps on the walls showed updated information about the entire bunker network, including sites that hadn't appeared in my grandfather's original research. Most shocking was a logbook that documented regular visits to the facility by personnel whose names I didn't recognize, but whose activities suggested ongoing government or military operations. The most recent entry was dated just 2 months before my grandfather's death, indicating that the bunker had been actively used even while he was conducting his research. I photographed everything I could with my phone, understanding that this evidence represented the proof my grandfather had been seeking for decades. But I also realized that discovering this facility had put me in significant danger from whoever was responsible for maintaining the secrecy of the bunker project. Chapter 11. The Final Letter. I returned to the farmhouse that evening and opened the envelope my grandfather had left for me, now understanding why he had insisted I discover the bunker before reading his final message. The letter was written in his careful handwriting, but the tone was more urgent and personal than his research notes. "Tommy," it began, "if you're reading this, it means you've found the bunker and understand the scope of what I've been investigating. I'm sorry to burden you with this knowledge, but there was no one else I could trust to continue this work safely." The letter went on to explain that my grandfather had been diagnosed with terminal cancer months before his death, but that he had also received explicit threats about his research that convinced him he was running out of time. He had sealed his workshop and hidden his most important discoveries to protect them from being destroyed after his death. He explained that the bunker project was still active and that the health and environmental problems he had documented were continuing to affect local residents. Several of his fellow researchers had died under suspicious circumstances, and he had become convinced that anyone who posed a threat to the project's secrecy was being eliminated. But the most important part of his letter contained specific instructions for what I should do with his research. He had arranged for copies of his most important documents to be stored with attorneys in 3 different states, along with instructions for their release if anything happened to me. He had also identified investigative journalists and government watchdog organizations that could be trusted to pursue the story if provided with proper evidence. "You have a choice," his letter continued. "You can walk away from this and live a normal life, or you can finish what I started and help expose a decades-long cover-up that has harmed innocent people. Either decision is understandable, but if you choose to continue, you must be extremely careful about who you trust." The letter concluded with expressions of love and pride, along with apologies for involving me in something so dangerous. But reading between the lines, I could sense his hope that I would choose to complete his mission and finally bring the truth to light. Chapter 12. Making the Choice. I spent 3 sleepless nights weighing my grandfather's final request against the risks of continuing his dangerous investigation. Part of me wanted to rebury the secrets I had discovered and return to my safe, predictable life in Minneapolis. But I couldn't stop thinking about the health problems my grandfather had documented and the possibility that people were still being harmed by whatever was stored in the underground facilities. I called one of the attorneys my grandfather had mentioned in his letter, a woman named Sarah Martinez, who specialized in government transparency cases. Our initial conversation was cautious, but when I described what I had discovered, she became intensely interested and agreed to meet me at a location away from the farm. Sarah arrived with a colleague and a collection of documents that corroborated many of my grandfather's findings. Her organization had been investigating similar Cold War-era projects across the Midwest and had suspected that Minnesota contained significant, undisclosed facilities. "Your grandfather's research fills in crucial gaps in our understanding of the scope and current status of these operations," she told me. "This could be the breakthrough we've been waiting for to force full disclosure and proper cleanup of contaminated sites." But she also confirmed my grandfather's warnings about the dangers of pursuing this investigation. 3 other researchers working on similar projects have died in the past 5 years under circumstances that raised serious questions. You need to understand that continuing this work will fundamentally change your life and potentially put you at significant risk. I looked through the materials she had brought, including evidence of ongoing health problems in other communities where similar bunkers had been constructed. Children with birth defects, adults with unusual cancer clusters, and environmental damage that had been covered up for decades. The weight of responsibility was overwhelming, but I realized that walking away would mean abandoning not just my grandfather's legacy, but also the people who were still being affected by decisions made in secret 70 years ago. I made my choice and committed to completing my grandfather's work, understanding that I was crossing a threshold from which there would be no return. Now, Chapter 13, Carrying Forward the Legacy. 6 months after discovering my grandfather's secret workshop, I found myself testifying before a congressional subcommittee investigating Cold War-era government projects and their ongoing environmental impact. The evidence I had inherited, combined with additional research by Sarah Martinez's organization, had forced the disclosure of documents that had been classified for decades. The bunker system my grandfather had investigated was revealed to be part of a larger network of facilities that had been used for weapons testing, nuclear material storage, and biological research programs that violated numerous environmental and safety regulations. The health problems he had documented were directly linked to groundwater contamination and soil pollution that had been deliberately concealed from local residents. My testimony helped establish a federal fund for medical monitoring and treatment of affected families, and cleanup efforts were finally beginning at the contaminated sites. But the process of seeking justice and accountability was proving to be as long and difficult as my grandfather had predicted. I had left my job in Minneapolis and moved permanently to the farm, which had become a base of operations for ongoing research and advocacy efforts. The grain silo that had hidden my grandfather's secrets was now a memorial and archive, documenting not just his investigation, but the broader history of government projects that had affected rural communities across America. The personal cost had been significant. I had lost contact with family members who preferred that these secrets remain buried, and I had faced harassment and legal challenges from parties who wanted to prevent further disclosure. But I had also connected with a community of researchers, activists, and affected families who were working together to ensure that similar cover-ups could never happen again. Standing in the farmyard where my journey had begun, looking at the grain silo where my grandfather had preserved his life's work, I felt the weight of carrying forward his legacy. The sealed building had contained more than documents and evidence. It had held a call to action that had changed my life's direction and purpose. My grandfather's final letter had offered me a choice, and I had chosen to continue his fight for truth and accountability. The consequences had been profound, but I knew that the secrets we had exposed would help prevent future harm and provide justice for those who had suffered in silence for decades. The old grain silo stood open now, its secrets revealed, and its mission transformed from concealment to education. My grandfather's ghost could finally rest, knowing that his dangerous knowledge had been passed to someone willing to carry the burden and continue the fight for justice. Thank you for listening to this story of family secrets, hidden truths, and the courage to continue a dangerous fight for justice. Please let us know in the comments where in the world you're listening from, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories about the power of uncovering the truth, no matter how difficult or dangerous it might be.